Alright then gang, so now I want to start adding some different routes for our API, and the first thing I'm going to do is just lay out all those routes right here so we can see what we're going to be building. So the first one is going to be a GET request, and that's going to be to /books, and that is going to return all the books in our data, which is just going to be an array in all likelihood in JSON format. The next one is also going to be a GET request. That's going to be /books/ID, where the ID is a route parameter, meaning it's interchangeable, it can change, and depending on the ID, we return a different book, and that again is going to be in JSON format. Then we have a POST request to /books, and this is to add a new book, and then it's going to return the book that was added in JSON. And then finally, we're going to do a delete request to /books/ the ID of whatever book we want to delete. That is going to delete the book from the data and also return back the book which was deleted in JSON formats. Now, we could also add more endpoints to this API, like an update endpoint, but for the sake of this tutorial and learning how to make the API, we'll keep it pretty simple and just do these 4. Alright then, so now let's create these different route handlers for the 4 different routes that we need. So I'm going to take the app again, and I'm going to attach a GET handler to this. And the first one is going to be to /books. So remember, this is a GET request to get all of the books. Now, the second argument is a function. And inside this function, all I'm going to do is say console.log, and I'm going to say all books. So eventually we will be returning some JSON to the browser, and that JSON is going to be all of the books. But for now, I'm just going to use this console log so we can see when we've made this request. And remember, in here, we get the context object if we want it, which is of type context. Now, at the minute, we're not using it, but later on we will do. So I'm actually going to format this a little bit differently, because what you can do with these GET requests is actually chain them on to each other. So I can say down here .get to chain on another GET request, and that's because this right here, when we use a GET handler or a delete handler or a POST handler, it actually returns the app itself. So then we can chain another GET request onto it or another POST request. So this time this is going to be to get a single book, so that would be to /books and then /ID, and we have a colon in front of the ID, meaning this is a route parameter and it could change. So again, we'll do a function. I'm not going to pass in the context object at the minute, and in fact I'm not going to do anything inside this at the minute because we're going to flesh these functions out later on. So for now, let's just set up the routes. The next one is going to be a POST handler, so we use the POST method to react to a POST request, and this is going to be to /books. And again, we'll do a function, but we won't pass anything into the function or do anything inside it yet. And then finally, we need a delete request, and that is going to be to /books/ :ID. Again, the ID is interchangeable. It's going to be the ID of whatever book we want to delete. So right here, let's do another function like so. So let me just test this out. I'm going to save it, and I'm going to open up the terminal so we can see this log to the console. And I'm going to go to /books like so. And we get undefined return to us because we don't actually send a response, but we can see this fire because all books is in the console. Now, I could send back some text if I wanted to right here. Let me just go down to the next line, and I'm going to say ctx.string. And this sends back a text response to the browser, so I can say all books, for example. And if I save this now and come over here and refresh, then we should see that in the browser, all books, cool. And if I wanted to, I could send back some JSON. So I could send back JSON like this, and inside I could just send back, for example, an array. And this is going to be an array of objects. I'll just do 2. And for each one, I'll just do a title, and we'll just say blah. And the title of this one is going to be blah blah. 2 really good books. Okay, so if I save this now and come over here and refresh, we should see we get JSON back now. Cool. Now, I can also, as a second parameter inside this method, and also inside the string method as well, we can pass in a status code. So for example, 200 means everything is okay. So I'm going to save that, and now we still get the same response, but we've also set the status code of the response as well. So now we've set up all of these different routes, we need to flesh out these handlers right here. Now, I'm not going to do them all in line inside this file because then this file could get pretty messy. So instead what I'm going to do is externalize these functions into a separate controller file. So we're going to be splitting our handler functions into separate controller files and following the MVC convention a bit more. Now, MVC stands for Model View Controller, but essentially all we're doing is creating a separate controller file for the books resource and putting all of these handler functions, all 4 of these, inside that file. Then we can export those from that file and import them into this file and reference them next to these routes. Now, this basically keeps our code tidier and easier to read and easier to maintain as well. So let's create a controller file. So first of all, I'm going to create a new folder called controllers. And typically, if we have more than one resource, say we have books, but also authors and maybe users, we could create a new controller file for each one of those different resources and place them all inside this folder. So we're just going to create one for books. So I'm going to call this book controller, if I can spell it correctly, book controller.ts like so. Okay, so now we need to create a function for each one of these different routes right here. So we need a function to get all of the books, a function to get a single book, a function to add a new book, and also one to delete a book. So let's flesh out those. I'm going to place an export keyword in front of each function because we want to export them and then import them here later on. So we'll say export const, and we'll call the first one get all books like so, set it equal to a function, and remember we get access to the context object inside each one of these functions. Remember that is information about the request but also how we send responses as well. Now we need to import this context type, so let me go over here and grab this import from the top and we'll paste it at the top over here as well. And we don't need the application. That's to create a new instance of the app. We just want the context. So let's save that. And I'm just going to copy this dude and paste it down here 2 more times because we need 4 functions in total. So the second one is going to be to get a single book, and we'll call that get book singular, not plural. The third one is going to be to create a book. So we'll call it create underscore book. And the final one is to delete a book. So let's call that delete underscore book. Okay, so we have these 4 functions, and now basically what we need to do is interact with some data inside each one of these functions to either get books, create a book, or delete books. But at the minute we don't have any data. Now typically this would come from a database like MongoDB or an SQL database, but we're not going to do that for the sake of this tutorial. Instead, I'm just going to create some local data. So the first thing I'm going to do is create a model for that local data. So to do that, I'm going to create a new folder and I'm going to call this models. Again, this is kind of geared towards MVC, M for model, C for controller. So inside here, let's create a new file and we'll call this book model. So .ts. Inside this file, all we need to do is create an interface in TypeScript to describe how a book should look. So remember, an interface in TypeScript defines what properties an object should have and what types those properties should be. So every book is going to be structured the same way. So what I'm going to do is actually just copy this interface from my repo and paste it in. So I've called this interface book, and inside I'm saying that each book must have an ID, which is a string, a title, which is a string, author string, and the number of pages, which is a number. All right. So that's the structure of our book objects, our book records, if you like. So now I want to import this from our book controller so that we can use it inside this file and create some local data. So let me first of all import that. I'm going to say import book from, let's go back up here, from, and it's // to come out of the current directory, then into models, and then we want the book model, .ts. Okay, so now we've imported that, let's create an array of data and place some book objects inside it. So let's create a new variable. I'll say let books, and it's going to be of type book array. So this means that only book objects can go inside this array, and we'll set it equal to an array. Now, I'm not going to write these out from scratch because I don't want to bore you. So again, I'm going to copy and paste these in from my repo. But you can see that each object, each book has an ID, a title, an author, and a pages property. So each one adheres to this book model right here. It has the same properties, and the types of those are what we specify right here. If we try to change this, for example, turn this into a string, then we get an error. So we're restricting the properties and the types of those properties inside this array. So let's change this back to 300. And by the way, these are not the true amount of pages. I've just totally guessed these, but either way, it doesn't really matter. We have our data now. So the next step is to interact with this data to flesh out these functions right here. So let's start with get all books. What do we want to do inside this function? Well, in here, we want to basically get all of this and send it back to the user in the browser or wherever they're calling this API from, and send them in JSON format. So the way we do that is by saying return, and then we want to get the context object, and we want to send back JSON, so .json, and we can pass in an array of objects in here, so books, and also specify 200 for the status code. So now we're just passing back this array of objects. This method passes it back as a JSON string to the user. Okay, so that's all we need to do in here. Oh, and by the way, before we go any further, let's register all of these things, all of these functions in our route handlers right here. So let me get rid of this function and get rid of this function and this one as well. And instead, let's replace those with these things right here. So we need to import them at the top. Let me do that. I'm going to say import, and we're going to import something from, and it's going to be .controllers/book-controller.ts. Okay, so what do we want to import from there? Well, all of these things right here. So let's do that. And I'm going to go onto a separate line, so we're not going all the way across to the right. And we want get all books. We also want get book. We want create book, and finally delete book as well. So we're importing all of those, and we can register them down here. So the first one is get all books. The second one is to get a single book, so get underscore book. The third one is to create a new book, so create book. And the fourth one is to delete one, so delete book. Awesome. So we've registered all of those right here. Now let's go back to this file over here, and we can flesh out these functions some more. So to get a single book, what do we want to do? Well, we want to find out the ID of the book that the user has requested first of all. So if we take a look in app.ts again, we can see that this is a route parameter. Now we can get that from the context object. So the way we do that is by first of all saying const, and then we'll call it ID. So let's use destructuring here. We're going to destructure the ID from CTX, which is the context.params. Okay, so this is the same as saying ID is equal to ctx.params.id, right? We're just using destructuring. So this is how we get the params on the context object, and we have an ID because that's what we called it right here. Okay, so let me go back to how we did it a second ago using destructuring. We have that ID now. Now what we want to do is try and find the book with the ID inside the list of books. So to do that, we're going to say const book to store the results of this inside a variable and set it equal to books, and then use the array method find. And then inside here, we pass a callback function, and we'll say b is of type book. And I'll explain this in a second. Inside, we're going to say b.id is triple equal to id. So what am I doing here? Well, this find method fires a callback function for every single book inside this array. And every time we iterate through it, we get access to that individual book, which is this thing right here, B. And you can call it what you want. You can call it BK if you want. It's up to you. And we're saying that that is of type book, which it is. Then we're saying, look, the ID of that book that we're currently iterating, is it equal to the ID that we have right here? If this returns true, it means, okay, that's the book we want, and it returns that value to this variable right here. If it's false, then it doesn't return that book, and it carries on to the next one to check that instead. So ultimately, we're going to end up with a book here, or if the ID doesn't exist in one of these, we're going to end up with no books at all. So we can now say, well, if we have a book, by saying if book, and if that's the case, we want to return that book to the user. So return, and then ctx.json, and we want to return the single book we find, and the status code is 200. Okay, so if that's not the case, then it's going to bypass this, and instead we're going to return ctx.string just to say that that book can't be found, so no book with that ID, and then we'll also pass a status code which is 404. And you also need to make sure that you spell return correctly, so return ctx.string, no book found with the ID, and 404. So that's this pretty much done. Okay, so now let's go down to this one over here, create a book. So again, what do we want to do here? Well, the first thing we want to do is take whatever data a user has sent along with this request. So normally you'd fill out some kind of form, right? And you'd maybe set a title, you'd set the author, the pages, etc. So that data is going to come along for the ride with the request, and it's going to be on this thing right here. And we can use a method on this context object to get all of that. So we can say const body, and that's all of the data, is equal to await, and it's ctx.body. Now we used await right here because this is an asynchronous task. So therefore we need to make sure that this is an asynchronous function. So we can say async right here. So what this does is return to us all of the data, or the body data that comes along for the ride with this request. So the title, it's going to be in our case, the author and the pages. That's what we'd need from this kind of request to add a new book. So we can get all of those from the body now, but instead of saying body.title, body.author, we'll again use destructuring. So we can say right here that we want the title property, we also want the author, and we also want the pages. So we're going to grab all of those from the body of the request now. So after we have those, typically what we do is maybe validate those. So we'd validate the data and the types of the data. So are they a string, are they a number, etc. We're not going to do this for this tutorial because I don't want to go off course too much. So I'm just going to assume that these things have all been sent with valid values. So the next thing we want to do is generate an ID for a new record, because remember, each one of these has an ID. So we need to import that ID library that we used a few tutorials back. So I'm just going to paste this at the top over here. So remember, v4 from this module right here, this was the module we used before, and we can use this now to generate a unique ID. So let's say first of all that the ID is going to be equal to v4.generate like so. So now we have this ID. Now we want to create a new book. So we'll say const book is equal to a new object where we have an ID property, the title, the author, and the pages. So this right here is going to assign all of these values and this value to this new object. It's the same as saying ID is ID, title is title, etc. But we can shorten that because the names of these things are the same. So that's going to create this new object for us called book, and then we want to add that to the array. So we can take this books array right here and just push this new one to it. So books.push, and we want to push the new book to that array. Awesome. Eventually we want to return that new book to the user. So let's say return, and it's ctx.json, the book, and the status code is going to be 201, which is kind of like a success, created that resource. So now we've created those three, let's finally do this last one to delete a book. Now remember, this thing over here, this URL uses a wrap parameter for the book that we want to delete. So again, we need to access that, and we can do that the same way. So let's grab this line where we did it before and paste it down here as well. So we have the ID. The next thing we want to do is try and find the book with the ID inside the array. So again, we can do that like we did before. So let's copy that line and paste it down here again. So now we have a reference to that book, but again, it might not exist because we might be trying to find a book with an ID that is not in that array. So we need to check, does that book exist? So we can say if book, and then if we find that book, then we can delete it. So to do this, we're going to be using the filter method. So we'll say books is equal to books.filter. And this is a bit like the find method. It fires a callback function for each book. So we'll say B to reference the book as we iterate over them. They are of type book. And inside this function, what do we want to do? Well, all we want to do is filter out the book where the ID of that book is equal to the ID that we grab right here. So we're going to say b.id is not equal to the ID. So basically, if this returns true right here, it keeps that book inside the array. If it returns false, it takes that book out. Now this is only going to return false if the IDs are the same, right? So if it returns false, remember it filters that out and we end up with the new filtered array right here. So we've reset this variable. We've updated the books now, okay, to remove that one. Finally, we want to return something to the user. So we'll say return, and it's going to be ctx.json, and we want to return the book that we removed. So book, which is this thing we found right here, and the status code, which is going to be 200. We'll just say that. So if we don't find that book, then down here, I'm going to say return ctx.string, and I'm just going to say no book with that ID. And then we also want to say 404 for the status code. Phew. Okay, so we've created now all of those different functions. And now when we make a request to either one of these URLs with this specific type of request, then those should fire and it should manipulate our data and send a response dependent on the request. So we're going to test it fully in the next video, but let's just try going, for example, to /books in the browser. Let's go up here and say /books, press enter, and we should get all of that data back. So that's the API pretty much made, but like I said, in the next video, we're going to test this out using Postman.